Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into a question that touches pretty much everything you buy, from your phone to your groceries. How big is too big for a company?
So let's start with a promise. This one was made back in 2011. Two enormous natural gas companies wanted to join forces to become one single giant. Their pitch was simple. A bigger, leaner company would be more efficient, and those savings, they'd get passed right on to you.
But would they really? I mean, that's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? When a couple of huge companies merge, are we creating a super efficient machine that benefits everybody? Or are we just building a bully that can stamp out competition and charge whatever it wants? And right there, that's the heart of what's called antitrust policy. It's this constant, high-stakes balancing act between the awesome power of big companies to get things done cheaply and the danger they pose to fair competition. All right, let's get into it. So, what's the core conflict here? Well, it really just boils down to a fundamental trade-off. You could call it the promise versus the peril of getting big. On one hand, yeah, bigger companies can be way more efficient. They have what are called economies of scale, meaning the more they make, the cheaper it is to make each one. And when they merge, they can get rid of all the stuff they were both doing separately. But on the other hand, if you only have one or two giants left in a market, they can crush any little guy that comes along. And for us, that means fewer choices, worse products, and, you guessed it, higher prices.
So how does the government decide when to step in and say, whoa, hold on a minute? It's not just a gut feeling. There's actually a whole toolkit of rules and measures they've been building for over 100 years to make these calls. This all kicked off way back in the late 1800s. You had these massive corporations called trusts that basically owned entire industries. So Congress passed the Sherman Act, and believe me, it had teeth. In 1911, the Supreme Court used it to break up Standard Oil, which controlled something like 90% of all oil in the U.S., into 34 different companies. And a few years later, more laws came along that gave regulators even more power to go after unfair practices. Now, to get beyond just, guesswork, regulators use a mathematical tool with a seriously long name, the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index. Let's just call it the HHI. It's a fancy way to put a single number on how much competition exists in a market. So how does it work? Well, the secret sauce is in step 2, squaring the market share of each company. See, by squaring the numbers, the HHI gives way more weight to the big players. A company with a 50% market share adds a ton more to the score than 10 little companies with 5% each. It's designed to sniff out markets that are dominated by just one or two giants. And you can really see the difference here. Back in 2016, the top 4 wireless companies in the US had almost the entire market. Look at that super high HHI score. But then look at the auto industry. The top 4 car companies had more than half the market, sure, but the HHI was much lower. That suggests there's a lot more real competition going on. A high HHI score is basically a red flag that makes regulators take a much closer look. But here's the thing, a tool like the HHI runs into a huge real-world problem. What exactly is the market you're measuring? Is the American car market just Ford and GM? Or do you have to include Toyota from Japan and Volkswagen from Germany? In a world where you can buy almost anything from anywhere with a click, these simple numbers are just a starting point. Okay, so it's not just about blocking huge mergers. Regulators also have to police what they call restrictive practices. These are all the sneaky ways companies can choke out competition without, getting in a room and explicitly fixing prices. Now, 2 of these practices sound almost the same, but legally, they're worlds apart. A tying sale is when a company forces you to buy product B just to get the product A you really want. That can be illegal. But bundling is when they offer you a deal to buy product A and B together, like your cable and internet package. That's usually fine and can even be a good deal for you. The difference is subtle, but it's crucial. And this all came to a head in probably the most famous case of its kind in modern history. In the late 90s, the US government went after Microsoft. They argued that Microsoft was illegally using its monopoly on the Windows operating system to take over other markets, like web browsers, by forcing computer makers to include Internet Explorer.
Okay, but what about industries where having competition is actually a bad idea, where it just doesn't make any sense at all?
This is what we call a natural monopoly. Think about your local water company. It would be incredibly expensive and just plain chaotic to have 4 different companies run 4 different sets of water pipes under your street. In these cases, one firm can actually serve everyone at a much lower cost, so breaking them up would just make things more expensive for all of us. So if you can't break them up, you have to regulate them. And there are two main ways to do it. The old school way is cost plus, where the company just adds up its costs and tacks on a guaranteed profit. It's safe, but there's zero reason for them to be efficient. The newer method is a price cap. Regulators set a maximum price for a few years, and if the company can figure out how to cut its costs below that cap, they get to keep the extra profit. It's a huge incentive to innovate.
This constant tug of war between regulation and the free market is always evolving. And we saw that play out in this huge experiment that really got going in the US in the 1970s.
The government basically decided to just step back. They removed a lot of the rules and price controls from major industries to see if pure competition could do a better job for consumers. And the poster child for this whole experiment was the airline industry. For decades, the government had decided who could fly where and what they could charge. All that was about to change.
And for passengers, the results were pretty amazing. New airlines jumped into the market, competition went through the roof, and average ticket prices fell by about a third. Twice as many people started flying. It was a huge win for consumers. But this new world also created a new kind of danger.
It's a phenomenon called regulatory capture. This is where things get a little weird. It's the risk that the very industry that's supposed to be regulated gets so cozy with the regulators that they start influencing the rules. The watchdog, in effect, becomes a lapdog for the companies it's supposed to be policing.
And that brings us full circle, right back to that Kinder Morgan gas merger we started with. In the end, what did the government do? Well, they tried to split the difference. They let the merger happen so the company could get more efficient, but they forced it to sell off some of its pipelines in a few key markets just to make sure some competition survived.
And what happened? Well, natural gas prices did fall, a lot actually. But, and this is a huge but, was it because of the merger? Or was it because of the totally unrelated boom in fracking technology that was flooding the market with new gas at the exact same time? It's almost impossible to say for sure. The real world is always messier than the theory.
So where does that leave us? This balancing act is far from over. The same questions we asked about oil barons 100 years ago, we're now asking about giants in AI, social media, and everything in between. Figuring out how to update those century-old rules for our new world to define what's fair, what's efficient, and what's just too powerful, that remains one of the biggest challenges we face. Thanks for joining this explainer.